Hey folks, welcome to Narratives. Narratives is a podcast exploring the ways in which the world is better than in the past, the ways it is worse, and the paths towards a better, more definite vision of the future. I'm your host, Will Jarvis, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and videos at narrativespodcast.com. Well, Josh, how are you doing today?
We're doing well. How are you?
Doing good. And everybody, for the audience, just want to note, we're also joined by Lars Doucet, a previous podcast guest, to talk to Josh today. Well, Josh,
Howdy.
Do you mind giving us a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Yeah, I'm interested in the big picture, economic and social justice. And the inspiration, I think, for what I and a lot of other people do is the 19th century political economist Henry George. And his motto was justice the object, taxation the means. And so I've tried to follow that and sort of, push that out into the world. I'm the director of a 501c3, the Center for the Study of Economics, and I'm the co-director of another outfit, the Center for Property Tax Reform. And what I've learned over the years is how to do this social justice and economic justice dream and vision and actually making it come real by talking to city officials and emphasizing tax reform as a part of the economic and social justice picture. And we think that tax reform, bringing in the Henry George idea of a land value tax, works, and it's worked all over the world. And of course, it's an idea without honor in its own land. Isn't it always the way? But Pennsylvania, with the progressive movement in the early 20th century, saw fit to permit land value tax. And it started in cities like Pittsburgh and Scranton. And it's been expanding ever since as far as legislative permission and adoption. So we have a bunch of towns and school districts all across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that use this because Pennsylvania, unlike a lot of places in, say, the Southwest or the Southeast or the mountain states, is kind of aging out, flat on its back, losing young people. The demographics are pretty bad, not too much in the way of immigration. So Pennsylvania really has to look for alternatives to the usual. And the land value tax has fit that role, especially in post-industrial steel towns and steel cities that just had the bottom drop out of everything. They got a lot of kicks to the gut when, say, 30% of the city's value would be one steel mill. And then whatever company in England owned it would knock it down. And overnight, everybody's taxes tripled or quadrupled. And so they understood when we finally came to them, hey, these clowns in London are holding on to all this vacant land now, and they're not doing anything with it. So make them pay for the privilege.
One more thing, when you said the taxes overnight tripled, which taxes were those?
The other taxes, the property taxes, and which is the prime source of revenue for cities in Pennsylvania and most of the country. So because there was no more building value, they blew up the factory. By definition, then the tax burden shifted to all the steel workers who had just been fired. So it was untenable. A lot of them flirted with municipal bankruptcy. And so they decided to adopt the idea of a land value tax. And it was great because essentially we were shifting, city spending responsibilities onto a holding company in London.
Very interesting. I'm curious, Josh, how did you first come to Georgism? How did you first discover land value taxes and decide this is the thing, I want to spend a lot of time on and work on?
Yeah, it's interesting. In college, I had a history professor, and I wrote a really duff paper on socialism and how it's going to sweep the world. And this was in the 1970s, and Socialist Workers Party and all that stuff. And my history professor, Mr. Neal, Dr. Neal, said, "Tell you what, there's another social reform that was just as big as socialism, and maybe that's something that you can look into." And so he suggested Henry George. So I looked into it and I went, "Oh, this makes sense." And so I became a fan, and and a guy that eventually became my stepfather, he became a fan, and then he attended the Henry George School of Social Science in New York City. And finally, after I had gone through life doing kind of trying to change the world through music, art, and other things, uh, I won on Jeopardy of all things. So
Nice.
I, yeah, I won $55,000. This is
Nice.
1991, and I said, you know what? I don't have to, knock my head against the wall anymore. And so I cast around for a little while, and I heard about the Henry George Foundation and CSE, and I called them up and said, "Hey, what can I do to help out? I think this is really great. I was like you guys. I was young back then. This looks really great." And he said, "Sorry, I can't talk now. My assistant just quit, and I don't know what I'm doing." So I said, "Really? Well, you need an assistant?" And the rest is, history, I guess.
Very
So,
cool.
and he taught me how to do the studies. This is really just as DOS was taking off. So there were no computers in this office, just some, fairly backwards ones. And we couldn't really crunch numbers. And Dr. Cord, my predecessor, he did all of his data analysis on paper with pen and pencil.
And to be
And
clear, that you're talking about Stephen Cord, right?
Stephen Cord. And he did it all by hand. And we'd go to a small town and we'd go to the city hall and sit down and put all this stuff into a loose leaf binder. And that's how LVT was adopted back then. And so happily, I was an early adopter of the kind of technology like GIS and data analytics that helps us do our job and makes it a lot more automated and helps us reach out a lot more.
And Josh, at the meta level, what's the biggest blocker to implementing LVT across the United States? Is it a political blocker? Is it a, like in concretely, if you had to pin it down to one thing, what is it?
First of all, anything that blocks change is people are wedded to routine. They really are. They don't like to try anything that's new unless it's forced onto them. That's why poor cities picked up on this first, because they were in trouble. And I'm empathetic. Well, no, I'm sympathetic to people in government, because we come and say, "Hey, here's this great idea. It's going to help your economy. It's certainly going to help your homeowners and small businesses." Meanwhile, they're juggling 4 dozen balls at once, trying to keep the lights on. One of our cities, Clairton, Pennsylvania, the street lights had just been turned off because they couldn't pay for it. The traffic lights were off. They had to let go of their police department. So that's how bad things can get. And essentially, I think it's as long as everything bumbles along, muffles along, as the British would say, nobody really sees any reason to change. There's no impetus for change. Then after that, it's going to be who we suspect. If I'm a land value tax advocate and analyst, it's going to be landowners, people that own valuable land that don't do anything with it. Now, if somebody has a vacant lot in New York City and puts up an Empire State Building, beautiful, great. But there's just as many, not just as many, but there are enough vacant lots right next to skyscrapers in Manhattan. And the only reason they exist as vacant lots is because the inherent value in those lots makes it very worthwhile to hold on and pay a stipend, a measly, couple of $1,000 a year for that lot. And so there's no reason for them to develop. And that's where land speculation comes from. So I would say that's number two. And number three, it's economics. When you bring up economics, it's sometimes very hard to communicate to people. So what I do is I listen to people. I go to the town and ask them, what's wrong in your city? Is there anything that really irks you? And yeah, it's what usually irks me or you guys. It's a neglect, it's abandonment, it's a sort of a colonial mindset of people from outside owning the land, and essentially all that infrastructure and value that's been built up is being pocketed. But that's hard stuff. But if I say to a community group, what's the big problem here in Francisville, Philadelphia? And they'll say, well, it's all these burned out houses, abandoned row homes. And I asked them, that's pretty bad. I bet the owners don't live there. And they said, of course not. It's a vacant lot. So what do you think happens if a building burns down? What happens to their tax bill? And everybody knew the answer. Homemakers, retired workers, they said their taxes go down. Absolutely. And what happens when you keep your house up? What happens when you and all your neighbors keep the neighborhood up and stable and safe and a happy, good, healthy place to live? And they all knew our taxes go up, which is why in Philadelphia, a lot of people never report their building improvements, which should change. But that repeats all across the country and all across the world, really. Australia, as some of you may know, is really getting a grip, getting a handle again on land value taxation because of the huge price inflation in real estate in recent decades. And so they're making a real effort to dump the really bad taxes, the stamp duty land tax, what we would call the real estate transfer tax. When you buy a parcel, you have to pay 10% of the value up front. That's outrageous and it's regressive. So Australia, at least, is learning how to dump that and go to a long-term land tax that includes commercial, residential, and vacant properties. And I think it's starting to show real results in Australia. They're starting to turn around the malaise of speculation or foreign ownership of land. And that's what we're trying to do here. But the first thing is indolence. Nobody wants to change. These habits, our cities have been run fiscally the same way for 125, 150 years. And
One thing you said that I thought was really fascinating was traditionally, if you read the traditional George's texts, George has that famous speech where he talks about what happens when the population grows, right? That population growth is this major cause of appreciating prices. And so there's this kind of common sense notion that land value tax, it's a solution for areas that are growing in population. But you've just laid out this entire example of places that are in decline. And presumably, in your view, land value taxation works just as well in areas of decline. That's kind of surprising to some people. So I was wondering if you could talk about exactly how that works in areas of decline and not just areas of increasing population.
It's kind of a rescue strategy, and it's something that is implementable right now. What do I mean by a rescue strategy? Well, let's look at Allentown, Pennsylvania. It used to be an industrial powerhouse, and it had the infrastructure to go along with it. The infrastructure that supported a population of workers in density and busy downtown, all that kind of thing, and roads, snow plows. It was expensive, schools. And then the industry left. They were in big trouble. So the question really is, it's like the flip side of a group that we work with sometimes called Strong Towns. And Strong Towns wonders, why are we spending all this money on infrastructure when it's never going to pay for itself? Well, hell, Allentown put up that infrastructure between 1920, 1950, and 1970. It's there. So you need a way to bring people in or back in to the town. And by lowering the taxes either on buildings, which is what LVT basically is, or if you lower other taxes, like in Pennsylvania, we have the per capita tax. It's an actual head tax. We have a wholesale business tax. We have a retail business tax. There are so many tiny taxes, and it's the death of a thousand cuts. And so it just doesn't make sense in a mobile, modern economy. No, I don't want to pay the sales tax. Okay, I'll go to Delaware, which has no sales tax. And so tax avoidance is very easy. The only thing that, as I think we know, that you can't avoid is a land tax. Nobody is shoveling dirt into a Mack truck, in the middle of the night and taking it out of Allentown and dumping it in Bethlehem. Doesn't work like that. So the site value is a lot of things, but it's population, and it's also the infrastructure the population has put in there over the years. And if you don't get that infrastructure paid for by bringing people back in to pay taxes on the land, we hope, then you're going to be stuck. So for a growing place, it's a no-brainer. We have Mark Loria with his idealistic self-made city in the desert that's going to be based on Henry George principles. More power to him. Where's he going to get the water? That's a good question. Federal government, I guess. But if you start a brand new city, it's obvious. In fact, a lot of property assessors in the cities that have come out against LVT, they've said, well, it's a good idea at the start of a city. Well, almost no city or community in the world ever in history has been, boom, let's go, cut the ribbon, open the city. It's an organic thing that gets built up, and the value becomes inherent in the land because of, number one, people want to be there, the natural advantage. And number two, they've spent money for this infrastructure. And currently, all over the country, maintenance and operations is the unspoken boogeyman of what's affecting old suburbs, old cities, and up and coming exurbs, is that we build this wonderful crap, but there's no plan to pay for it down the road. And the only way to pay for it down the road is to have a self-generating loop of revenue. And that's what the land value tax is. So as far as a rescue plan for poor cities, it's worked. A lot of the Pennsylvania cities were able to move out of what is essentially municipal bankruptcy because they were able to get more businesses back in town. They were able to get more people moving in. And as small cities became kind of a hit place to move into, they can take advantage of that.
So if you could kind of walk me through it step by step, just kind of break down the microeconomic incentives for me. So like take a place like Detroit, right? A place that presumably needs rescuing now, could you compare kind of the incentives of the status quo system and then talk about how an LVT might help rescue, say, Detroit the same way it did these other towns you said that it helped with, and so I can kind of like understand how it makes that difference, even if the population's not going.
Yeah, in the general sense, Detroit is interesting because so much of the city is now owned by the government. That was sort of their reflexive reaction to the collapse of the auto industry and therefore the city. Cuyahoga County, St. Louis, same thing. And government really doesn't have any strategies for getting that land back onto market. And it's sort of like land banks. That's the new flavor of the month. And a land bank is going to collect the land that's been abandoned. They're going to put it together, assemble parcels, and then, but it's like catch and release. And then they're going to put that land back into the same polluted stream of bad taxes and anti-capital and anti-labor policies. So in the micro sense, half the city is owned by the government and they don't have any clue how to get it back onto the tax rolls, even though it's still, the infrastructure still serves it. And in the other context, what you've got is pennies on the dollar is what it costs to sit on a vacant lot and buy land. They ain't making any more of it. That's, one of the oldest and hoariest cliches, but it's true. In Detroit, the corporate savior of Detroit is the guy that owns Quicken Loans. And what's he doing? He's buying hundreds of parcels. Deutsche Bank, right after the 2008 recession, they bought hundreds of almost abandoned, almost worthless lots in Cleveland and Pittsburgh. Why would they buy it? Because the holding price is pathetically so small. There's really no reason to do anything with it except to sit on it. And cities don't have time for that. People don't have time for their neighborhood to burn down around them until they're the only house left, and the rest of it are absentee landlords. I think that flipping the script on absenteeism, speculation, is key to unlocking this land. It's locked up either by government that's out of ideas, or it's locked up by people who know a great investment when they see it.
So you're saying that when a city comes into decline, it basically gets this additional kind of headwind on it as people just buy land, and then if the building on it burns down, as you say, like they pay even less property tax. So and they might as well hold on to it because it's so cheap. It'll, on the off chance it'll go up in value in 10 years, it'll have been a smart investment now. And that just keeps anyone from coming back in and improving things. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying, especially about residential properties. Now, another thing that's happened, I'll use Pittsburgh as I think a pretty good example. When all of these steel companies went bust and then all of the supporting industries went bust, they didn't walk away from their land. They have good lawyers and they have good knowledge of tax law. So most of these parcels were given to the Urban Redevelopment Authority, URDA. And I can't think of a better phrase, URDA. It's a nonsensical phrase. So this property goes from the company to the Development Authority, which is a quasi-governmental authority, and they get a nice tax break for it on their federal taxes, actually. They get the depreciation, and if it's donated to URDA, they have tax credits that you would not believe, because you and I will never be eligible for them. So that's what the corporate side does, the commercial side does. And on the residential side, you're going to hold on to it until the market turns, or more likely, a desperate state or city government says, look, let us buy this land from you, and we'll redevelop it and turn it into a community land trust, that kind of a thing. But essentially, the city is so desperate that they go scrounging behind the couch for loose change to buy these parcels that are worth not much money at all, and they pay a lot for them to get them out of the hands of the speculators. And and that's that happens a lot. When we look at the numbers, they are astonishingly the same across cities. The numbers of vacancies and how value is essentially kept. It's like holding your cards close to your chest. You're a speculator. You know how much the land is worth in a good market. So
can you quantify that for us? You said the numbers are kind of the same. What kind of numbers are you seeing in these situations?
The numbers are a comparison of a lot of different numbers, but it's who owns the land, who owns the city. And in a place like Philly or Detroit, it's people that don't live in the area, in the city. They don't have a stake in the community. And if you don't have a stake in the community, you don't care. All you want is some money to come back, and it's great for them because if there is a building on it, you can depreciate the building just by sitting there, and you have a good accountant. But the building depreciates over the course of 10 or 20 years. And what do LLCs that own residential properties do? They sell their LLC to another LLC, and the depreciation schedule starts all over again. Now, is this a new company? Probably not. It's just transferring one LLC to another, and in the end, they're controlled by the same group of dentists in North Jersey who are buying land as a speculation. So you also look at places where the city says, we're going to rebuild the city. Here we take a stand. That's the best thing that these people could hear. That, oh, you're going to take a stand. That means the land is immediately going to increase in value. We have in Philadelphia a plan to cap I-95, which is the big interstate that goes through the city. Terrible desecration in the 1950s, and it is today. But everybody says, okay, we're urbanists now. We're all urbanists. So all of that land around I-95 that's going to be capped, and they're going to put up trees and birds and chirping things, all that capping is going to increase the land values directly, of course. And that's where they're going to make their killing. Also in Philadelphia, as an example, I can use, we had a casino, and for years, there was a derelict dock, a pier, that used to be, for freighters and for international trade, sort of the good old days for the USA. And it was valued at $10,000 on Columbus Boulevard, which is prime waterfront now. But it was valued at $10,000 because the zoning was industrial. We're going to bring back industrial jobs. We're going to the usual siren songs. But instead, the owners took advantage of zoning. And zoning is sort of the unspoken behemoth. Zoning trumps land value. It's one of the few things that do legally, because you're using the police power of the state to really change by fiat almost the value of a site. So this pier was zoned overnight to dense commercial, and a casino was built, but and everybody was really happy. Mugger just had a nice new source of victims, and there was some ancillary land value appreciation. But that pier went from $10,000 in value in less than a month to, I think I'm right, but to about $900,000, simply because of the stroke of a pen. And if people pay attention to bond issuance, if people pay attention to urban redevelopment plans, and nobody does, most regular folks don't, you can make yourself a killing. So that's speculation.
Will, I'll let you take the mic back in a sec here, but I got to ask one more question, which is you mentioned zoning. Now, some people say we don't need LVT at all. All we got to do is fix zoning. And you've just said that like zoning is a big deal. Zoning can trump land value. How do you feel on the subject?
If we zoned that pier to $1 million, which the city did, but it's still empty. And so the property tax that falls on that upzoned parcel, okay, instead of $500 a year, no exaggeration, you're going to be paying $25,000 a year. That's worth it. If you've got 300 of these self-same parcels all across the country, it's no big deal. It's going to show up on your bottom line to some degree. But as long as the rate on that land stays low, it can be upzoned. You can change the zoning, but it's going to, as long as you keep it vacant, it's going to really be very doable if you're a speculator. So the idea is to kick the market let the market kick them in the ass. In other words, realize the actual value of that land by charging what it's worth. Paying for the privilege is a phrase I use all the time. Great, okay, you're sitting on 100 acres of land with, sewers and roads, etc. And you're not paying anything for sitting on it. So that's a privilege in my understanding of what the word privilege means. It's an absolutely medieval concept. And the only way we can upend that is to end the privilege, or they can pay for the privilege. You don't want to build, knock yourself out, but you've got to pay for it.
So it sounds like just fixing zoning's not enough.
I don't think so, no.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
In fact, I'm sure of it, because if we look at the Bay Area, nothing's affordable, and zoning has been changing in the past 10 or 15 years, but nowhere near enough, because it's still cheap to sit on the land that you keep underused or vacant. Now, that's an extreme case, the Bay Area, but it plays out.
Well, this leads to my next question. So Bay Area, this is probably the, most expensive, like city-wise piece of real estate, if you just took the whole city in the world, Center for American Innovation. What, if I gave you, a couple, let's say, $100 billion, could you go in and, bribe some city officials and make this happen? And what is the process? I guess what I'm asking is, what does the process look like to implement LVT? Like, mechanically, is it going to like city hall, going to a town council, pitching to town council, getting buy-in, et cetera, like, and how do you approach that?
That's a great question. And I take my lessons from history, of course. And in the good old days, Joseph Stalin didn't start out as a dictator. He started out as a punk from the Republic of Georgia, shooting up post offices and stealing money. That's how he started. So in the positive sense, an LVT advocate is going to go to a town council or a city council and start small. And we've already done that, which is why I think it's time to move beyond. We've shown it can be done. Just like, I know it's bad humor, but to just do what Stalin did. Just get more ambitious.
Yeah.
But the idea is that you ask, as I said earlier, you ask the people, what's wrong with your city? What do you want fixed? And tax policy is how we can address a lot of these problems. And so you get one council person on board, and sometimes they become Georgists. It's really strange. They start to see the solution in everything. But as a practical sense, they know that bringing in the land value tax is going to kick the land wasters off the land, and it's going to give a break to the doomed, to the people who never get a break, who never get anything. And I sometimes use hyperbolic words like doomed, but if you go to some of these cities in the Midwest or wherever overseas, the general sense is doom, because only a very few privileged people are able to control the levers. Now, in these smaller cities, which is where we start, you do have to get support. But in Altoona, we had a land value tax that was almost the ultimate in a sense, because there was no tax on buildings. But for years, they had done this over the course of 10 years, shifting the tax on buildings down and down. And the city manager, who is recently deceased, unfortunately, he said, no one's going to even notice that this is happening until about the 8th year. Then you're going to run into trouble. I said, really? But all these homeowners are saving hundreds of dollars a year on their tax bills. He says, don't worry about them. Worry about the people whose taxes are going to go up. They're going to come to City Hall with the proverbial pitchfork represented by a legal firm, and they're going to terrify the city at some point with threats of action. Now, in Altoona, it was a car dealer, but he wasn't really a car dealer. He was a land speculator. He was a used car dealer. I'm not going to name his name because I did it once and they almost tried to sue me. But it was a new car dealership that did very well for years, and then Altoona just collapsed. The bottom fell out. It used to be the world's leading steam engine repair town. Well, we don't do steam engines anymore. So the whole edifice fell. And so what he did, the car dealer, is he's kept selling cars, which is good money, and he kept buying the lots up and down this main street that was a feeder into what were built later to interstate exits. And he was in between both exits. And so by the government intervening and building these exits, what did that do? It created value. And the value capture, he wanted to capture the value for himself, which is really how this works. We create the value and some schmuck comes and takes it. And so a land value tax is intended, directly intended, to sort of countervail that. And after 8 years, Bud, that was his name, the Chevy dealer, I won't give you the last name, but Bud said, if you don't get rid of this, I'm going to leave town, which would have been the best thing that could have happened. But Bud played golf with them, with some of the council people. And that's how things work, as we know, politics. And even though 80% of all the homeowners saved over 50% a year on their property taxes, that was not their concern.
So Josh, Lars, go ahead.
No, we're probably gonna ask the same question.
Yeah. Well, let's see if it's the same. Josh, how do you think about like how do you reinforce these? Like how do you, I guess, reinforce the walls here so that you get to year 8, Bud comes around and starts complaining, or maybe even worst case, it's Steve Schwartzman. It's like private equity. They come in like, hey, like we bought all these homes in Detroit. We're really mad that we don't want this anymore, and we got a ton of money to spend. How do you stop that? Is it just like, the Georgist movement needs to raise a lot of money and be prepared to like go to war over these things? Like when you hit year 8, like is there anything else mechanically you can do? I don't know.
Well, that's a great question. And I think that's kind of why we're here. The Georgist movement back in the day had tens of thousands of energetic, youthful boosters who talked about this issue day in and day out. It had a great effect on the early part of the 20th century in this country. And as a movement, it sort of withered with the advent of socialism, sort of socialism light in the United States. And
like Lars said, the car, right? So if you can expand out, if you can move to the suburbs, you can, the need's a little bit less.
Yeah. I mean, you can have an urban growth boundary like Portland, Oregon does, which actually just makes the land much more valuable inside. And then there's the growth boundary, and people skip it. They just go another 25 miles or 40 miles into the countryside and form this ring of suburbs outside of the urban growth boundary. It is like Portlandia in that sense, people making awful choices and not looking ahead. So where were we? I made such a great point about Portland.
So how do we so people brought this up, that it's like, oh, it's a great theory, but you're corrupt people are going to come in and they're going to shut you down, which to me just sounds like a general argument that works against any policy change you want to make. Like anything good you want to do is going to be resisted by some entrenched interest who's going to make a buck if you don't do it. Yes. So the question is, what does the solution look like for Georgists? Was it just that the institution was so weak, there's no standing up to the buds of the universe? Or was it that there was something deeper at work?
I don't think there was anything deeper at work. I mean, politics is corrupt, and it doesn't matter what the issue is. And maybe I'm getting on another soapbox that's not appropriate, but the corruption of society in the United States and a lot of the rest of the world since the end of World War II has been growing apace. And I think that one thing that gets people back, is going to get people back, is the continuing localization and devolution of government to lower and lower and smaller levels. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. My vision is to go back to the future. In the Middle Ages, when things were going to hell in a handcart, Northern European cities banded together and they started the Hanseatic League, which reopened trade, but not amongst empires or countries, but cities. And I think things are going to get a little smaller and more manageable. Small is beautiful, the old phrase goes. And if it's more manageable, people can have more input. People don't have input in a lot of decisions. And we have social media, and we have things that didn't exist when Altoona first enacted LVT. None of that existed in 2001. Right. So now you can name and shame bad actors. And I hate to say it, but that's often the road to success. And if there's young people out there, they love to name and shame. I read the papers. That's what happens. So name and shame the right people. And I think things can turn around.
But
yeah.
Just as a pushback on that, I mean, can't the buds of the world do the same thing? I mean, so what, so is there more to it than that though? Because it's like, what stops the local car dealer from being like, here's all these awful YIMBY Georgists who are trying to, these land communists or whatever they want to call us, like what makes us come out on top of something like that? Is it just that the demographics are on our side or what?
Demographics are definitely on our side. And by that, I mean the people, the people's side. And the sort of regimented, cemented structures that have been running our country for a long time at every level, they're starting to weaken. There's pretty much the CDC right now is a laughingstock. That's crazy. When I was 20 years old, the CDC was like church. Everybody respected it. Nobody talked back. And now people are going. So there's that much uncertainty in the air, and Bud can count on, or could count on, nobody knowing. And say what you will about social media and the internet, keeping information tamped down is really difficult.
So that's what you're saying, is that it's less about necessarily putting someone on blast and using a cancel mob to get the job done, and more that there's no smoke-filled rooms anymore where nobody will know what the backhanded deal was. Is that kind of what you're saying?
The smoke is clearing. We'll always have smoke-filled rooms. But the
I guess we can all smell it now.
Yeah, but, sunshine is the best, antiseptic or whatever sterilization medium, and light. That's why they call them sunshine acts. And you have to take advantage of what reformers who have come before you put into place. Things like open records, FOIA, open data. A lot of the work that we're doing with the Center for Property Tax Reform, if you go and look at our maps and our projects, all of those were those city databases were gained through open data. In other words, I don't have to beg the city of Seattle for their database. It's there. It's there for the taking, and it's updated thanks to API. I'm getting a little wonky. But thanks to API, it's getting updated on a daily basis, if need be.
That's really interesting, because like in Texas, we don't have that, right? Like there's the property transactions are probably all in the real estate databases. What do they call that?
MLS.
MLS, yeah. But like an assessor probably doesn't have access to those. But Pennsylvania famously is supposed to have this like really good open data. I mean, I guess, Will, you could jump in on this if you want to.
It does seem to be a lot better than I'm no expert by any means, but Pennsylvania does seem to have good records in that department.
Well, it's legal, and I think it's required for real estate transactions to be public. Texas, specifically in 2007, ended the public reporting of real estate transactions. So Texas legislature decided to lock that down, and that was in 2007. I'll
I
tell
didn't
you
realize
why.
it was. I didn't realize it was that recent.
Yeah, I mean, there used to be there's a land office in the state of Texas, and it used to have every parcel on a paper map, every county, every parcel, and then it was digitized, and it's still out there somewhere, but it's been locked down. And so, any freedom-loving Texans should get together with a class action suit. And the reason I know this is because we've been asked to look at Texarkana. And Texarkana is, do you guys know Texarkana at all?
Fill us in. Like,
Super bizarre place. It was a railroad depot in the 1870s. And as you can guess, Texarkana is on the border of Texas and Arkansas, two different cities. One's in Texas, one's in Arkansas. The Texas one has a high property tax, and it's a much healthier community, which is what I would expect as a land value tax person. On the Arkansas side, most city revenue comes from the sales tax, and the sales tax falls on almost everything, including food. So there's an idea to unite these cities in sort of, and we'll see how it goes. This is in the opening stages, but getting the data is really tough. And it used to be easy, assessment data, I mean, and it used to be pretty easy and automatic in Texas.
wait, just the assessment data or like market transaction data?
Assessment data. Assessment data should have sales data too. It won't tell you, who owns everything, but you'll have a sale date. Most assessments have this. When was it sold? What kind of a sale was it? Was it arm's length? Was it a legitimate sale? And the date, and who sold it and who bought it. Mm-hmm. So that stuff is out there. It's essential reading for any reformer. The explosion of LLCs, I was talking about them earlier. The explosion of LLCs is a reason why we need that kind of information out, because LLCs are, shell companies. They're covers. If you see how many are based in Delaware, you know why, because there's great tax advantages to doing that, but it also grants a lot of anonymity. In New York State, I know that in the Assembly, they passed a law opening up LLC ownership to a small degree, but it's a start. I think that's where we are in this whole thing, along with like-minded people that want a better world for everybody. It's a start, and all of life is a start, and then you start again. Just no defeat, no surrender.
It's been interesting what you were saying before, where you seem to be of the opinion that the best place to start is at the local level and work your way up. So like, it was interesting you mentioned the Hanseatic League. So I'm Norwegian, like that's where my mom's from and stuff. And it's interesting when I compare my experience as an American citizen as my experience as a Norwegian citizen, because Norway is a very small country. They're not part of the EU, right. And Houston metropolitan area has more people there's more Houstonians than there are Norwegians in the world. And not counting Minnesota. But like, what's interesting is just like the level of distance between you and your government officials at the highest level in Norway is much smaller, and the communities are much smaller. And so, I've actually like heard that there's some interest in LVT there. Like a government official or two has like contacted me after I did some writing over there. And I'm just wondering, I just bring those things to just kind of illustrate like the question of scale, and what is the path you see for getting LVT in America, specifically with all of our layers of stuff of government, with like the Texas Supreme Court disallowing LVT, and then also at the state level not having public real estate transactions. How do you even start? Do you just have to go to a favorable other state in a favorable city in that state and work your way up there, or how do you see it going?
Given the reality is that, I'm one of the only employees of the center. I'm one of the only employees of the Center for Property Tax Reform. That it's very it's tiny. It's small, and the only way you can get more victories is to leverage the small victories. I mean, one thing that Georgists will never do is, pick up a gun. Uh, so, in contravention of Joseph Stalin, we're not going to go that route. We never can. We're humanistic. But the idea of proving an example to another town is, I think, the way forward. When McKeesport, Pennsylvania, adopted LVT in 1980, the surrounding towns of Clairton and Duquesne, they started suffering relatively quickly because this was during the steel collapse that I referenced earlier. And they started collapsing rather quickly. In other words, all the demolitions kept going on in those towns. Any business licenses would go to McKeesport because they had a land tax. It was cheaper. Essentially, you make it cheaper to do life and to do business in an LVT city. And so within 3 years, Clairton and Duquesne adopted LVT.
Okay.
So you're showing, the power of competition, and I think that that's the only way to do it, at least at this local level. But again, we've got to aim big. And, it's sort of, I hope to pass on the torch, if you will, to, an activist, righteously angry bunch of people who can read some lessons from what we've done and what Stephen Cord did and Percy Williams before him, and a lot of other places like the Schalkenbach Foundation, and expand it. I mean, there was a high watermark. Australia had a national land tax, and World War II paid to that, and of course World War I sort of put an end to the LVT movement in the UK. But you can get back into that. We look at the examples of Singapore or Hong Kong, and they're not LVT per se, but they collect the economic rent of land by hook or by crook, and they turn it into investment in infrastructure or lower or no income taxes or business taxes. And that's what you do. We're collecting something called economic rent, which is a hard concept for a lot of people. When you think of rent, you think, oh, I pay $350 a month, for my locker room, my storage locker. That's not what rent is, of course. And so I try to communicate the idea of rent by putting it in the terms of saying, well, this is part of the tax. Well, we know that LVT is truly not a tax, but you got to roll with what the people know. So
one way I've heard people put it is that you're either paying the tax to a private entity or you're paying it to your community.
Yeah, it goes into private pockets, and that can be demonstrated over and over, especially with the sort of ancillary movement of land value capture. There's a very smart colleague of mine in Washington named Rick Rybeck, and he wants to change the whole terminology. And I think he's onto something, calling it land value recycling instead of a tax, because that's what it is. It's a self-enclosed loop. And if you look at Singapore and Hong Kong, they have that kind of loop of rent to public services collected back in rent. And it's circular, and it's a natural way of doing things, as opposed to the millions of dead ends. In Norway, Bergen was one of the big Hanseatic cities. I just wanted to point that out. I mean, I've been a fan. I've been to Rostock and Lübau and Bremen and Bremerhaven. Did you know that Finland has a municipal land value tax?
I did not know that one. No.
Yeah, they're not Scandinavian, I know, but in a way they are. They're not Norse. But
Geographically, Finns will argue with you about it.
yeah, I think they will. Finno-Ugrics.
And they should.
I'm never going to call Helsinki Helsingfors. But yeah, they have a municipal land value tax. It's been around for 15 years. Estonia has a national land value tax.
Right. Yeah, I have heard of that one. Yeah.
It's small, and there's always the pressure of the landowners.
Right.
But in Estonia, it was done for a very pragmatic reason. They wanted to get rid of their Russian minority, and that was a good way to do it. So you can do bad things with LVT, I suppose, as well as good things. But that's the interesting thing, is that land is at the heart of everything, and it's the heart of every activity.
Well, I mean, it's like if you're applying it consistently, right, and you're not just like targeting it towards a specific ethnic group or something, and that's actually something that's actually interesting, is talking about like the status quo. You sometimes like will read a paper about how property tax can be regressive, or land tax can be regressive, and at least in the studies I've seen, in the places they find that it turns out to be regressive and it like hits this community or this racial group more than others, it's usually because the assessments themselves are bad, right? And I was wondering if you could speak to that it's like, if you can get accurate assessments, then it becomes progressive and equitable.
Yes, it becomes more progressive, the land value tax. Even the property tax can be somewhat progressive, taxing land and buildings. But we've done some research for the city of Philadelphia. It's on the website. And we asked ourselves, how can we prove LVT will be progressive? And it was actually pretty simple. We took all the taxable land value in Philadelphia, split all the properties by quintiles, and the bottom quintiles are the lowest valued land, where generally poor areas or areas of minority representation, and a land value tax benefited them by several factors, as far as saying 15% a year savings, as opposed to the very richest properties in wealthy Philadelphia neighborhoods, and also Center City, Philadelphia commercial districts. They paid more, and they paid a lot more, because and I'll send you guys out the PDF, because it's really easy peasy. And I've been thinking about it for years, but there's so much to do. But Mason Gaffney said LVT is a progressive tax. I don't know. Yeah, but how do you prove it? And so I think
I'm really interested in that analysis. I'd love to see that. But just to play devil's advocate, you sometimes see reports that it's like particularly African Americans have more of their wealth in housing than they do in other assets. For instance, I've seen charts like that I believe. And so some people say that implies that land value tax would be racially regressive, because white people have less of their wealth, like more of it's in stocks, less of it proportionately to their total asset stuff is in housing. Is there a response to that?
It's the racial component is an economic component. If I took you to Plattsburgh, New York, we would have the same outcomes, but 96% of the city are white. They're not black. So if you go to Appalachia and did the same kind of analysis, the people that are going to get hosed are poor. And in our eastern cities and our western cities, although western cities are losing black population pretty quickly, but if you look at our cities, that's an artifact, an economic and cultural artifact of the Great Migration from the South to major American cities after World War II. And in that sense, they suffered because they went to get jobs in the industrial North. And really, after redlining and after the Interstate Act, which demolished, I think, dozens of neighborhoods, if not hundreds of neighborhoods across the country, it disproportionately affected Black people in Black neighborhoods. Uh, we've been working closely with close-in neighborhoods in Philadelphia that are primarily Black. And LVT turns out to be a way to save them from, save is not the right word, but to give them relief from the real estate boom that's driving.
So your numbers find that it does actually result in a more equitable outcome for those racial groups than the status quo.
Yeah, or economic groups. I mean, to me, they're interchangeable. It has to do with, who's got the green. And in Altoona, nobody owns anything except for their house. They don't have anything.
I mean, is the argument kind of that it's like, okay, so like maybe a poor Black family or a middle income Black family, right, might have more of their relative wealth in housing, but less wealth overall. Like Bill Gates is the single largest private landowner of farmland in America, but
yeah.
probably most of his wealth is Microsoft stock, so
Yeah.
it's possible for someone to be like richer in an absolute sense, but less of their relative wealth is tied up in housing, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there's no way, or it's very difficult for the Black community to buy in to the system.
Interesting.
Now, maybe we should create a new system, and I would be more than happy to support that. Communities based on community land trusts, and also community stockholding, community shares, that kind of thing. It's been done. Berkshire's and Ithaca has, Ithaca Bucks or something. But those are really designed for, happy, hippie, small college communities. But if you translated that concept into a working class neighborhood, you can certainly create wealth, and wealth that stays in the community. I mean, the Black community produces plenty of wealth, but it leaves, that same night. It goes to the absentees.
Interesting.
They work there, they work as hard as anybody else in this world. The Klan's claims notwithstanding, they work harder than anybody else, but it's stolen through rents at the end of the day. And so I agree with you. Nobody's going to steal from Bill Gates because he owns all the cops, so to speak. And he has patent interests, and patents and things like that's protected by an army of lawyers. And that's a damn hard thing to beat. So in the Black community, if their self-produced wealth stays in the community, then they're empowered, and they can end white world supremacy where they live by making these changes, these reforms. One of the first books I ever read was The End of White World Supremacy by Malcolm X. I was 8 years old, and I went, wow. I was really moved by it, and he was good. Anyhow.
Well, we're coming up on the hour here. Do you have any more questions?
Yeah, Josh, I just want to recap. It sounds like, like with any movement or in policy implementation, hysteresis really matters. So success begets success. And, if there's a history of things not working, it's hard to get that turned around. I do think we're at a place where, wins will start stacking up and it will start heading in the right direction. These things can accelerate very quickly. But it sounds like to me, like your ideas about how to implement land value taxes in the US are, okay, you start with, what's the easiest municipality to implement land value tax in? You get a win, you get a slightly larger, slightly bigger fish, bigger municipality, you win there, and you go on up the chain until it's San Francisco. Is that correct? Am I on the right track there, or is there some other approach that's better?
No, I think for what I do, you've got it. You start with the low-hanging fruit, to overuse a cliche. And you have this basket of fruit, and what do you do with it? You share it with people. You share the knowledge of it with people. But we're working now, CPTR in New York City, and we've got a pretty good exhaustive analysis of land vacancy and land blight in New York. And the upshot of that is, okay, so what? Well, now our next project, Part B in New York City, is following the ownership. And the ownership follows the wave of gentrification that destroyed these neighborhoods in the outer boroughs of New York City. And the first move towards reform happened with a mini pilot program that we worked on with then city controller or Manhattan Borough President Scott Stringer. And it was simple, but we took every, not we, but a law was passed and the research worked that every vacant lot that was residential north of 110th Street, I mean, I'm being really obscure here, but that's the way the law is defined. It went from a very low tax to a much higher tax. And in this pilot program, what used to raise, I think it was like $800 a year, or $800,000 a year, now raises about $10 million a year. Plus, there's houses on top now. So the pilot program was tiny, but it was spearheaded by some powerful elected officials, mostly Black, in Harlem. This is South Harlem. And it was signed into law by David Patterson, who was then the governor of New York. So starting small and moving up can mean a lot of things. It can mean grabbing a town. It can mean liberating a district and giving it back to the people. There's a lot of ways legally that it can be done without firing a shot.
Well, I guess just to collate that, like if I gave you like a large resource problem pile, let's say, it's like $50 million today, go crazy, implement land value tax in the U.S. Your goal is to get as many, plots of land in the U.S. Covered with LVT as possible. What's your approach there? Is it pick the next easiest municipality and just move up on the list? Is that correct?
The next best step would be to grab, like I said, a district, say Washington, D.C.
Gotcha.
Or some sort of self-contained, like a city-state,
okay,
like Hanseatic. And if you got the District of Columbia to do this, you would be pricing out immediately the speculators, because it's almost every level of tax except for federal tax. And there's an alternate to that too. The city, instead of paying, having its citizens pay income tax, could pay what they would in income tax to the federal government by giving them a share of LVT. So if you think about it, it's possible. We did research for the city of New London, Connecticut, to do just that. And it really turned out to be not monumental as a project. Of course, it was voted down by the big landholders, but we did pass in Connecticut a bunch of laws that permitted cities to do it. But I think that if I had $50 million, I would approach the community land trust idea now, which in my mind's eye is a little flawed because economics has been removed from it. You pay rent, but the rent is notional. And so the rent essentially is so low, it makes it essentially for either preserving farmland or preserving an economically depressed area in amber. Now, if you had a community land trust that had non-residential properties that paid rent on an annual basis to the nonprofit that owned the CLT, then the CLT would, again, have a self-sustaining raison d'etre, and they could also expand, into a scattered site model, start buying up land. That's what the Georgist single tax communities failed to do in the early part of the 20th century. They bought their little bit of land, and if only they had taken some of that land value and bought more land, then they could have brought about justice one plot at a time.
So how would you, if you want to do it right, how would you do it?
The land trust, it would simply be expansion. In other words, you would treat it like any part of the economy. If you have the ability for a willing purchaser to take your money for land, give it to them. and it's a one-off. And so then, because you have a C3, you have theoretically something in perpetuity. And so you would retire that upfront expense pretty soon.
That makes sense. Well,
I
Lars.
hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. Lars, do you have any other questions before we let Josh go?
No, I don't think so. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I mean, I guess we could talk. I mean, we're getting kind of late in the podcast here, but I guess we should probably ask at least one question about our assessment project. If you want to ask him a little bit about that.
Yeah, what's the best tack to take there, you think, in the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, just to clarify for the listeners, Will and I were awarded a Astral Codex 10 grant to do an assessment project in Pennsylvania because of the various objections to Georgism. One of them is that you can't actually do assessments in real life that are accurate, separating land value from building value. And my part 3 was an empirical analysis of the latest research papers, interviewing Ted Gwartney, who's this big famous Georgist assessor, and some other people, and just looking at the data. And it seems like you can do it, and a lot of new methods have come out over the past 10 years, but it does seem like you need good access to good data. And so we'll talk to some people, and we put together a grant that's like, why don't we try to reproduce some of the state-of-the-art methods in the place in America with the best data, which people tell us is Pennsylvania. Regardless of what the quality of assessments are in Pennsylvania, supposedly they have good market transaction data that's public. So the question becomes, how do we do this right? And what new value can we do that doesn't just like reproduce redundant stuff people already know? Like, how can we do a good job that brings new knowledge into the world?
And it's replicable across areas and jurisdictions. To leave you guys with a bit of advice, Pennsylvania, or I should say Philadelphia, has really good market data, and it's curated by several universities. I think Drexel does a really good job, Drexel University. And so they curate it, and they also do lots of time series. And for a good analysis of assessments, you have to spread it out over a period of at least 3 years, in my humble. And also there is the realtors in Philadelphia have supported land value tax for 10 years now. And I think they're rationalizing both the valuations and the reporting of data, knowing who your neighbors are, knowing who owns the property, and being able to come up with patterns of valuation within CAMA areas. And Philadelphia has a fair amount of vacant land sales, which is, a sweetener. I mean, the claim is that you can't separate land and building values. And I don't know if you know it, but in the early part of the last century, every city produced parcel by parcel land value maps that were pretty accurate. And New York City, for example, Chicago, for example, they were all on paper. It was miraculous. I have some in the archives. So this is reinventing the wheel. It's uncovering something that was covered. Land value, if you took a realtor by the hand, any of you, into any place and asked the realtor, what's that land worth? There would be an answer pretty quickly, and it would be pretty accurate, because their money, their cash flow as a realtor is based on transactions, and sensible transactions. That's why the phrase arm's length transaction is used so much. It's a free, fair, and unfettered record of an actual sale. And land values are easily a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are authorities, Dr. Ed Mills, I would say, is one. It says, you can't split the two. I think that's an assumption. It's a lazy assumption too.
I think I know that paper. I might have been in one of my 3 articles. It's like, you can never trust just one article entirely by itself. You want to look at the whole body of the research, because you can find any one paper that says anything.
Absolutely. And I think that using Edward Mills is commonplace because he's well known, for a land economist. People like him. He's glib. He gives good speech, and you get yourself situated like that, and nobody will ever contradict you. That's the way organizations and systems work, as we know. But yeah, I think that Philadelphia would be a good approach. And I think we have, it's interesting. I think that the former mayor of Philly, Michael Nutter, who's on the board of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, I think he's thinking of coming back to Philadelphia to run for mayor again.
Oh, cool.
So
cool.
We shall see.
Yeah. Well, we'll give him a pet policy to run on if he does.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that the Center for Property Tax Reform is soon, by that I mean in weeks, if not days, releasing an assessment survey after having talked to assessors in cities all over the country. All I'm helping with is the proofing.
Cool. Well, we'll be very interested in seeing what that has to say.
Yeah, that'd be
Absolutely.
great. Well,
awesome.
Thank you very much, guys.
Josh, thank you so much for coming on. Where should people find your work? Where should we send them?
Send them to the Center for Property Tax Reform, one word, .org. And for me, urbantools.org. And unfortunately, it turns out I named Urban Tools after a Finnish sportswear company.
Nice.
But I got the domain.
Good stuff.
And I
little
just
domain speculation.
Thoughts, blogs, articles, videos, you name it.
Good stuff.
It's a deep subject, as you all know. Property is in the blood of every American, certainly, and most people.
Yeah.
Love it.
Cool. Well, thanks for talking to us, Joshua. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime. Love to talk to you again.
Special thanks to our sponsor, Bismarck Analysis, for the support. Bismarck Analysis creates the Bismarck Brief, a newsletter about intelligence-grade analysis of key industries, organizations, and live players. You can subscribe to Bismarck Brief at brief.bismarckanalysis.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Narratives.